One day, a 15-year-old girl went out to buy some sweets and never came back home. The police investigating her disappearance discovered a number of strange and unusual leads, but despite that, it took them more than 30 years to solve this case, and the truth was revealed in a completely unexpected fashion. Christy Wesselman was born on April 19, 1970, in an American village of Glen Ellen, Illinois. She lived there with her mother, her sister, and two older brothers. Their small suburb was considered to be one of the safest areas in the district, and Christy would often spend hours simply exploring the neighborhood with her friends. She actively participates in school activities and was even elected class president. In addition to that, she was a member of both the volleyball and the softball teams. In the summer of 1985, when Christy was 15, she came back home from her extracurricular classes at around 3:30 and decided to run over to the local store to buy some sweets for herself and her mother. The store was very close to their house, so her mother expected Christy to be back in just a few minutes. Despite this, her daughter did not return for quite a long time. At first, her mother simply thought that Christy ran into her friends and got distracted. Very few people had cell phones at that point in history, so she could not easily contact Christy. However, as it got late, she became worried and decided to phone the homes of her daughter's closest friends. None of them saw Christy. After that, her mother looked for Christy at the store she went to, but could not find her anywhere. Her relatives searched for Christy for several hours, but by about 2 a.m. they decided to contact the police. The authorities immediately joined the search. The first thing they did was attempt to unscramble the timeline of events leading to Christy's disappearance. The police contacted an employee at the store that Christy was going to visit. The man was familiar with the girl. They lived close to each other, and he was often asked to babysit Christy when she was still little. He confirmed that Christy visited the store at around 4 p.m., purchased some chocolate, and left. She was in a cheerful mood, and nothing in her behavior struck him as odd. The investigators found other witnesses that saw Christy visit the store, but none of them could say where she went after. The authorities also questioned the girl's friends, but all they learned was that none of them saw Christy that day. The only thing they could do now was search the streets. The search was made harder by the fact it was very dark outside, and even though they searched until morning, they failed to locate Christy. By midday, the next shift of policemen came to relieve the original investigators. One of them proposed that Christy could have taken a shortcut when going back to her house from the store, through the field. At that time, the residential area and the store were separated by a large plot of land overgrown with tall grass. Whenever the local children wanted to visit a store or hit up the local McDonald's, they would walk directly through that field, creating a narrow trail through the grass. An investigator followed along the path and quickly noticed something unusual in the grass. After a closer look, he realized it was a body and it belonged to Christy. The investigator immediately informed his colleagues. As the body was handed over for a medical examination, they began investigating the scene of the crime, but they could not find any footprints, personal belongings, or, for that matter, any other leads. The medical examination determined the cause of death to be 8 stab wounds. In addition to that, they discovered signs of sexual abuse and collected DNA samples that belonged to the perpetrator. Unfortunately, the science of DNA profiling was only in its infancy at the time, so the samples could not be investigated. They were placed in storage instead. Christy's mother also told the authorities that on that day her daughter was wearing a pearl ring. It could not be found on the body or anywhere near the crime scene. The investigators concluded that the ring could have been taken by the perpetrator and decided to investigate all pawn shops in the vicinity in case the criminal tried to sell it off. The authorities focused their investigation on searching for any witnesses that could have seen Christy or the culprit anywhere near the field. They managed to find several people that took the shortcut sometime close to the probable time of the crime, but none of them saw anything unusual. The grass in the field was so thick that even though the body was lying just a couple steps away from the trail, it was extremely difficult to spot it. The investigation also found out that the crime scene was located only a few dozen feet away from a private residence, but none of the people living there heard anything unusual. An employee of a gas station situated only 200 feet away from the field spent the whole day within sight of the trail, but he also did not notice any suspicious activities. The investigation seemed to get more mysterious by the minute. The investigators concluded that the victim could have been personally familiar with the criminal. That could explain why Christie did not scream or make any noise. It was a small suburb, and many residents knew each other by name. The police began investigating all men that knew Christie and looked into the past criminal convictions of people living around the area. Several suspects were considered, but none of them could be linked to the crime. The authorities continued investigating every lead they could find, but time and time again, they failed to make any progress. The investigation was stumped for 3 years, but then an unusual development occurred. In 1988, DNA analysis began to see widespread use in criminal investigations, and the authorities began collecting samples from the suspects that could have been involved in the case. Most of them complied with the request, and their samples did not match the material discovered on Christie's body. However, one person refused to provide his DNA for analysis. It was a 34-year-old man named Dana Henry. He lived very close to the field in which the murder occurred, and so he was under suspicion from the very first weeks of the investigation. At that time, he denied any involvement in the crime. However, now that he refused to cooperate with the investigation, the likelihood of his involvement increased. The investigators obtained a court order and summoned Henry to a hearing. He maintained that he was innocent, but he was accused of contempt of court and placed under arrest. After spending several days in a cell, Dana Henry agreed to provide his DNA to the investigation. It did not match the samples found on the body, and Henry was released. After regaining his freedom, Henry told the media that he was stripped naked and kept locked in his cell. He was only released after being coerced into cooperating with the investigation. He noted that he spent somewhere around $50,000 to pay for the services of lawyers and that this event completely ruined his life, all despite the fact he was never even officially accused of the crime. By the end of 1985, Christie's relatives were contacted by a man that called himself Willis. He hinted that he may know the identity of the criminal and provided them with a number of leads. The authorities followed up on every single one, but with each new dead end, they realized that they were investigating wild rumors or even completely unrelated hearsay. This went on for almost 4 years, at which point Christie's family could not put up with these lies any longer. Willis was prohibited from ever contacting them again by the order of the court, and he was even investigated as a suspect. However, he turned out to have no connections to the crime. In the year 2000, the culprit's DNA sample was entered into the FBI database, but no matches could be found. Since then, the case has gone cold for years. Occasionally, the investigators examined new leads, but no amount of work could bring them closer to finding the killer. 30 years later, no original investigators remained on the case, and Christie's death was being investigated by a completely different team. In 2015, they were surprised by a sudden notification from the FBI database. The criminal's DNA sample was matched by a new sample recently uploaded into the database. It belonged to a 62-year-old man named Michael R. Jones that lived in the city of Champaign, about 150 miles away from Christie's house. His DNA was entered into the database when he was arrested after being reported for abuse by his wife. According to a bill passed in 2002, all residents of Illinois suspected or convicted of a crime were required by the state to provide their DNA samples. The bill was introduced and sponsored by the state's attorney of the county where Christie's murder took place, and it was this exact case that spurred him to lead this project. After getting a match, the authorities wasted no time investigating Michael. Immediately, they realized that the man was neither a suspect nor a witness in the case. In fact, he was never on the investigation's radar. Michael had a concerning criminal history. He was first noticed by the police when he assaulted a woman in the mid-70s, although he escaped conviction at that time. However, just a year later, he attacked and sexually assaulted a 27-year-old woman before leaving her in the parking lot of a hospital. After becoming a wanted man, Michael turned himself in. During his hearing, he said that he deeply regrets his actions and insisted on being mentally unwell and requiring treatment. However, a psychiatric assessment confirmed that he was perfectly aware of his actions, and Michael was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. Despite that, he was paroled for good behavior only 6 years later, being released in 1983, 2 years before Christie's murder. Notably, Michael's victim was never notified of his early release. She went on record as saying that if she knew, she would have done everything in her power to contest this decision. 1 year after his release, Michael got married, but in 1994, his first wife left him and obtained a restraining order. The reason behind this decision was Michael's disturbing behavior towards her younger relative. However, no other legal action was taken. In 1999, Michael was arrested for physically assaulting a relative of his new girlfriend. Additionally, the investigators found out that the man enjoyed going on long, solitary trips on his motorcycle, as well as that he often visited his relatives in Chicago. Considering that Glen Ellen was only 25 miles away from downtown, it could very well be that Michael passed through the area on his way to meet his family. That would easily explain the fact that he was never a suspect in the case. If he was only passing through Glen Ellen for a few hours, connecting him to the crime would have been almost impossible. Christy's mother said she had no idea who Michael was. When the authorities spoke to her on the subject of his involvement, she did not pay it much mind. After all, it was just another suspect in an investigation 30 years old. However, everything changed when the investigators confirmed Michael's guilt and personally visited her to tell her that they found her daughter's murderer. Before officially charging him with his crimes, the investigators spoke to his former girlfriend and found out some additional information. They were told that Michael had an unpredictably violent temper. At one moment, he could have been calm, and at the next, he could fly into a rage without any imaginable reason. He also enjoyed reading detective models and spent a lot of his free time watching true crime documentaries. With these new facts in mind, the investigation suspected that Michael could be linked to a number of other unsolved cases, in addition to Christy's death. After all, he constantly traveled alone, he had a tendency towards violent crime, and his interest in related media could have given him some knowledge of effectively concealing the evidence of his crimes. Michael R. Jones was officially accused of sexual assault and murder on September 18, 2015. He refused to admit his guilt and was taken to court. It took 3 long years before the hearing finally began in 2018. The prosecution insisted on a life sentence, but Michael decided to plead guilty in exchange for receiving a lighter sentence. According to the conditions of his plea bargain, he was not required to disclose any details of his crimes, but the total DNA match left no doubts to his guilt. In the end, he was sentenced to 80 years in prison, with no possibility of parole until 2095. In other words, it's very unlikely that Michael will ever walk free again. Christy's family was deeply grateful to the investigators for finally solving this case. However, her mother expressed regret over the fact that Michael was released on parole back in 1983. After all, if he served his full sentence, he would not have had the opportunity to attack Christy at all, and she would still be alive and well.